Ever catch yourself wondering, like, what's the connection between how we think and what we end up believing, especially when it comes to politics?
Yeah.
It's kind of wild, right? Well, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into this whole intelligence and political views thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and, our source material this time around, bold, to say the least.
Oh,
It's titled, Why Conservatives Have Lower IQs, What the Science Tells Us.
wow. Okay. They definitely aren't holding back.
Straight to the point, right. So,
What?
obviously, gotta unpack that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, where's that coming from?
Exactly. So diving in, they highlight a couple of studies that suggest a link between lower intelligence and childhood think, like way back,
Yeah.
and then stronger prejudices popping up later in life, often through more conservative ideologies.
Hmm.
Yeah, and there's this one study by psychologists Gordon Hodson and Michael Bussery, and they found that folks with lower cognitive abilities, they might actually be more drawn to clear rules, structure, that kind of thing. Things often found in conservative ideologies.
Makes sense. I mean, the world's a messy place.
Totally. So some brains might just crave that simplicity.
Yeah, exactly. Like, some people want black and white, others, they're cool with the gray areas.
That's such a good way to put it. And there's this other study from the UK this time, mentioned in the article, and they found a connection between childhood IQ scores and later on leaning towards, you guessed it, conservative ideologies.
Hmm. But so, like, does that mean...
Hold on. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, got to emphasize these studies. They're looking at averages, not saying every single person.
Right, right, of course, yeah.
Because obviously you've got brilliant minds all over the political spectrum.
Sure, it's way more nuanced than just saying low intelligence equals conservative. Too simple.
Right, like how our brains prefer to take in information, that's got to play a big role.
Exactly. And that's actually something psychologist Brian Nosek argues, that these ideologies, especially the conservative ones, they give people a way to deal with how complicated the world is, offer a simpler framework. And that can be really appealing to some.
So even really smart people, if it fits their existing worldview or just feels comforting in all the chaos.
And might gravitate toward it, yeah.
Fascinating. So it's not just about raw brain power. It's deeper than that, right? It's how our minds try to make sense of things.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting, because it's not just what's going on in our heads.
Oh, there's more. Okay, lay it on me. What else is in the mix?
Well, you can't underestimate how much education and just like who you're exposed to socially shapes your politics.
Right, that makes sense.
Like, studies constantly show higher education levels connecting with more liberal viewpoints.
It's like the more you know, the more you realize, whoa, I don't have it all figured out.
Totally. And then you're cool with things being a little messy, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if you haven't had those experiences, it's easier to just stick with what you've always known, even if it's based on prejudice or just overly simplistic.
Right. It's like it's comfortable, familiar.
Totally. And that really highlights how important it is to encourage critical thinking early on, Make sure people are exposed to different ways of seeing things.
Oh, absolutely. Huge. But, speaking of different perspectives, I got to remember, not every conservative fits neatly into this lower cognitive ability box we've been talking about.
Right, of course. There are plenty of brilliant conservatives out there.
Yeah. And there are even studies suggesting that people into classical liberalism actually might score higher on certain intelligence measures.
Oh, okay. Now that's interesting. So we've been talking mostly about social conservatism, but what about the economic side of things
Hmm.
or libertarianism? What exactly IS's classical liberalism and how does it fit into all of this?
Sure. So classical liberalism is this political ideology really emphasizes individual liberty, limited government, free markets, that whole thing.
Okay, so more about freedom.
Yeah, like freedom of speech, religion,
Hmm.
but also economic freedom. So free trade, low taxes, that kind of stuff.
Got it. So someone who's into classical liberalism, they might have conservative views when it comes to the economy, but then on social issues, more liberal.
Exactly. Two sides of the same coin, kind of. And get this, there was a study by Noah Carl. He found that people who said they were socially liberal Republicans, which often lines up with those classical liberal views, they actually scored a bit higher on verbal intelligence tests than Democrats.
Whoa, really? That just goes to show how, you can't make blanket statements about this stuff. It's way more complicated. So we've got social conservatism potentially linked to lower cognitive ability, but then classical liberalism, which is often lumped in with conservatism, potentially linked to higher cognitive ability. It's a lot.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why it's so important to not oversimplify those connections.
Yeah.
You can't just like put everyone with a certain political label into one big group and assume things about how their brains work.
Yeah, for sure. Nuance is key here. It's not as easy as all conservatives think this way, all liberals think that way.
Nope, not at all. Because both intelligence and the ideology, they exist on a spectrum. Got to remember that.
Totally. It's not about saying one side is smarter than the other.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about understanding the differences in how we think and how those differences might be playing out in our political landscape.
It's really interesting to think about. So, well, there seems to be this potential link between lower cognitive ability and a liking for those simple frameworks. We've got to remember, intelligence isn't the only Hezbollah thing influencing our political views.
Right. Like, what about authoritarianism?
Oh, right. That's a whole other aspect, isn't it?
Totally. We can't ignore that because authoritarianism, which is often seen as a key part of right-wing ideologies.
It emphasizes obedience to authority and strict adherence to social norms, right?
Exactly. And guess what? Studies have shown that there might be a correlation between lower cognitive ability and being predisposed to those authoritarian tendencies.
Interesting. So are you suggesting that people who are drawn to authoritarianism might be less comfortable with critical thinking or ambiguity?
It's not necessarily about being capable. It's more about how different people process information and deal with uncertainty.
Yeah.
Remember those studies we talked about by Hodson?
Yeah.
Well, they actually found that having lower abstract reasoning skills.
Was more likely to be linked to, you said, authoritarian and prejudiced views?
Exactly. So if someone has a harder time with abstract ideas or finds comfort in really clear-cut rules, a more rigid authoritarian worldview might make them feel more secure, more stable. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Because it simplifies things. It gives you clear right and wrong, good and bad. No need to grapple with all the messy gray areas.
Precisely. And, those same studies also found that people with those lower abstract reasoning skills, they also tended to have less contact with folks from different backgrounds.
Which, like we were saying earlier, that lack of exposure can just reinforce those existing prejudices. Makes it less likely you'll ever really question what you believe, even if it's based on, well, not much.
It's like this big web, right? Your cognitive abilities, your social experiences, they're all tangled up together, influencing each other.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is there a connection there between that potential link to authoritarianism and the whole thing we discussed earlier about simplified frameworks being so appealing, especially within conservative ideologies?
Oh, good point. Like maybe for some, those simpler frameworks feel safe, like they align with how their brains prefer to process things.
Exactly. It's like a perfect fit. It all just clicks into place. So we're not just talking about intelligence on its own, right? It's more about cognitive preferences, how we're raised, who we interact with, even just how our brains are literally wired to deal with complexity.
You got it. It's like this big, complex puzzle. But it's important to remember that all this research, it's not about predicting anyone's political beliefs or telling us how individuals will behave. It's about getting a deeper understanding of the human mind, seeing how our thinking processes, for good or bad, shape our political realities.
It's funny, right? Because we started with that title, Why Conservatives Have Lower IQs. And at first glance, you're like, really? That's a bit much.
Yeah, it's definitely attention-grabbing, but
But as we've been talking this whole time, it's obviously way more nuanced than that.
right, it's not like every conservative is walking around with a low IQ. It's about like all these different pieces fitting together. How we think, what we're exposed to, even just our own individual life experiences, all that shapes our political views.
And the thing that really sticks out to me is just how powerful those simple narratives can be.
Oh, totally. And not just in politics, right? We see that everywhere.
Absolutely. You've got politicians, media, you name it, using these super catchy slogans, oversimplifying everything, playing on emotions, instead of actually like having a real discussion?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be like a critical thinker. Don't just take everything at face value. Look deeper, especially when someone's trying to sell you easy answers to really complicated problems.
Yeah, good point. No easy answers. So it's like this research, in a way, it's a call to action for everyone, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. It's about, first of all, looking at yourself, recognizing your own biases, actively seeking out different points of view, and then, maybe most importantly, just being able to actually talk about these things respectfully, even when we disagree.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah,
It's about fostering greater understanding, basically, of how our minds work, how our differences, even down to the way we process information, they're all part of this big, messy, beautiful thing we call politics.
this deep dive has been honestly kind of mind-blowing. I feel like I have a much better grasp on all this now. How intelligence and ideology, they're not separate, they're all tangled up.
Me too. Me too. It really makes you think, huh. And it's important to remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to uncover.
For sure. But hey, I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder for now.
Definitely. Hopefully they're walking away with, like, a more well-rounded perspective.
Two more insightful conversations and maybe, just maybe, a little more appreciation for those gray areas in life. Until next time.